The time has come to tell the truth.
I'll wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Oh, and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will, and in this episode, I'm delighted to be once again joined by Chris Clarke, the author of the magnificent The Dark Knight and The Puppet Master, and author of a new paper that he's just published, Putting Down the Vase. Welcome back to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks a lot for having me, Will. Great to be back again.
It's great to have you on again. Now, could you give us sort of like an explanation as to perhaps the title of this paper initially, Putting Down the Vase? What is the vase that is being referred to tantalisingly in the title?
Yeah, it's the kind of idea behind the piece was obviously Labour is a year into government and has had I think it'd be fair to say a very brief honeymoon and a very tough year certainly for a government that's just won such a massive majority. So I was kind of interested in there was this metaphor of the Ming vase, which has come up. It's a kind of one of the most kind of common, slightly niche, but one of the most common metaphors in UK politics in some ways. It was originally used by Roy Jenkins to describe Tony Blair before the 1997 election. He compared him to a curator carrying a Ming vase across a polished floor, i.e. the prospect of power, the prospect of Labour finally winning and the fear of Labour again throwing it away, being this kind of precious artifact that he didn't want to drop, didn't want to mess up, and that metaphor came up again. It was used a lot in relation to Keir Starmer's approach, the kind of small target strategy people sometimes called it, or kind of zero risk strategy, and it was a source of frustration for people kind of on the left or on the sort of centre left in places. But my kind of hypothesis was about the Ming vase politics almost being a fact of life these days for mainstream parties, who have to exit who essentially live in a media environment where they're almost continually attacked and pilloried, and their approach is a Ming vase risk aversion, which I argue in the paper is kind of counterproductive for a range of reasons, but actually kind of fuels populism.
Mhm. Absolutely, and you make that distinction, don't you, between politicians who are sort of like part of kind of like the more established parties and those who are sort of part
Yeah.
of the more kind of like insurgent parties, especially obviously Nigel Farage, with reform, and you pick out particularly instances when established political parties have attempted to ape populism in some ways with particular leaders. So Corbyn with Labour, and Boris Johnson and Liz Truss with the Conservatives. Do you think that this is something that is always going to be a problem for established political parties, that if they seek a sort of a kind of populist approach or elect figures who are populist in some way, that the kind of tension between them being established party of government or established party of opposition, that contradiction is always going to sort of end badly, as it did in the three instances that you pick on in the paper?
Yeah, I mean, I think the for both the major parties, they are uh, beholden to appeal to broad swathes of the electorate and hold together very disparate coalitions in places. I mean, historically, collecting kind of 90% of the vote between the two of them means that they need to stitch together coalitions that involve uh, close to 40 or 50% of the electorate. So the approaches during those periods, the kind of Brexit years, the Corbyn years, kind of was for these big parties to adopt kind of quasi-populist approaches. And as someone within Labour who's very critical of Corbyn, I certainly thought that was the wrong approach. But it also illustrated essentially how hard it is for these parties to do populism because it actually alienates large numbers of people they need to support, and it also it involves taking making promises or professing easy answers that actually don't stand up to the scrutiny of government if you win. Um, uh, so that for those two reasons, really, the breadth, the need to appeal to a broad coalition, and the um, need to actually do the things you promise, mean that populism is not really available to parties of government, as I call it in the paper.
Absolutely. And the paper is divided into four sections. So there's communications, electoral strategy, general policy, and specifically migration policy. Um, what was it about those four particular areas that you felt it was important to analyze through the lens of this kind of like, carrying the Ming vase across the polished floor?
Each of those are areas where I suppose in some ways it was just an easy way to divide up the paper, but each of those are ways where areas where it feels like there is almost a Ming vase formula, which is in relation to communications. You've got this incredible scrutiny that public figures and politicians are subject to, which they weren't previously subject to, and the Ming vase refers to a kind of reputational management, message discipline, not saying anything that's going to cause a news story or create surprise, and a kind of an almost retraction into a safety zone where you're getting safe media lines out. Electorally, the Ming vase sort of refers to the the kind of instinct to believe that you've got a safe core and that you can play different groups off against each other. And I suppose the tactics of taking certain voters for granted and offsetting others, and I suppose you'd call it triangulation, but which is something that all parties have had to try and do as the electorate has become essentially less tribal in how it votes, but has led to a kind of relying on a base right up until the point where it suddenly becomes clear that that base isn't there to be relied upon. So the Ming vase refers to this kind of assumption that there's a base and that you kind of go for these slivers of voters. In policy, following straight on from the kind of electoral thing, there is a kind of formula which is you focus on the bread and butter valence issues that voters care about, the NHS, education, defence, crime, etc., where there's kind of mainstream support for more doctors, or more police on the streets, and you fund that through growth, which is in many ways a perfectly sensible strategy in terms of it focuses on what people want, but a bit focuses on what people want, but it's not a long term. It's an approach which is very difficult for voters to actually engage with, and it's a quite a risk averse approach in a way because it's a formula dependent on delivering outcomes for people in a quite which they might not necessarily notice. And then migration is a slightly different one, but I suppose because the main threat does seem to be coming from reform, or certainly did when I started writing the paper a month ago, 2 months ago. Is the essentially the terror that this issue can completely swipe your feet away from underneath you, and the kind of panic that breeds, which means you start sort of throwing good money after bad and trying to fix it. So that they kind of just fell into place, the four areas, but each of them was a place where there is a safety zone or risk aversion, it felt.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things, and you mentioned it at the start of that response, is social media seems to be something that political parties, to some degree, particularly established political parties, have difficulty kind of engaging with in some ways. You mentioned message discipline there, and you can certainly see that in terms of, sort of like how MPs obviously conduct themselves online and that kind of tension between perhaps the way that you might, in the past, as an MP, have responded to a constituent, as to how you might respond to a constituent or someone who's engaging with you online now. Do you think that there's this kind of like difficulty, particularly with social media, in terms of formulating a kind of like a response and being careful about what you say when the more sort of like populist parties or elements seem to not really care too much about the way that they conduct themselves on social media in some senses, focusing more on kind of like popular trends and kind of like focusing on just driving that interaction to them. So, for example, Nigel Farage with and Reform using TikTok quite readily, whereas the official number 10 TikTok hasn't been used since Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. Do you think that's kind of like a problem, that relationship between sort of social media and the idea of the Ming Vase, of message discipline, of knowing how to respond?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I mean, I should say I'm not a super social media person myself. So I can't claim to know exactly the kind of the details of what works really well on TikTok and things. But if another a kind of synonym for the Ming strategy is the small target strategy, and putting yourself out there on social media inevitably creates a larger target, particularly if you're saying anything that goes beyond, you know, great to be at the local hospital and see the great work they're doing. So there's and essentially a party of government has more to lose than to gain by
Mhm.
doing that. And a populist, be it Nigel Farage or Zach Polanski, has more to gain than to lose because they just need to raise their profile to such a that's a core dynamic of it, I think, is engagement with social media and essentially in general risk taking in the public domain. You know, just saying what you
Mhm.
think sometimes, or shooting from the hip, is kind of disincentivized for a party of government and is increasingly incentivized for a party of opposition or a populist party.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think that's also interesting that you pick up on in the paper is the idea of sort of like rigidity in terms of sticking to the manifesto, and that can be kind of a problem in some ways, particularly obviously given that the world that we're in now is perhaps different from when the manifesto was being
Yeah.
written. How much do you think that has to be the case? I mean, obviously, you know, you will get opposition parties saying, "Oh, well, you've abandoned this manifesto pledge, you've abandoned that kind of like
Yeah.
manifesto pledge." So it's sort of like a difficult balancing act. How do you think the government should sort of like respond to that in terms of like, you know, how much they can deviate and how much they should sort of stick to the manifesto?
Yeah, I mean, the piece wasn't looking to say it's not worth the paper it's written
Hmm.
on, chuck it in the bin now type thing. But I think clearly the government came in knowing there was very low trust in politics. Um, and I think their approach has been a relatively a kind of to be squeaky clean and to be technically um, sticking to the precise technical policies. And you could apply that to the manifesto, where they've been very much like we can't break that, even though we actually really need to, because it's a manifesto pledge. You could also apply that actually to their approach to um, political conduct.
Hmm.
The idea that the nub of of dealing with low trust is to
Hmm.
just say there's going to be absolute perfect financial. Every MP is going to be held to a really high standard in terms of their expenses and things
Hmm.
like that, which quite aside from how hard it is to uphold when you've got uh, lots of people with messy lives,
Hmm.
is actually doesn't completely get to the nub of low trust in politics. So both of these are kind of whether it's the manifesto or the kind of ethos of public service are approaches to trust which I wouldn't say they miss the point, but they are only part of the point because they believe that there's a kind of a sort of slightly clinical, almost legal contractual relationship with the public, which can be upheld. And actually, people that's not really how it works for people. For example, lots of people believe that Labour's broken the manifesto pledge already in relation to winter fuel allowance, for example, which isn't a manifesto pledge, but everyone thinks it was because it felt like something that
Hmm.
they weren't expecting Labour to do. So uh, what I guess I was saying in relation to the manifesto was more about having a kind of what would you call it? Uh, the spirit the spirit of what people were expecting, rather and really understanding what people were expecting, rather than believing you'll get lots of credit in terms of political trust for going, well, technically, actually, we didn't do that, but technically, we did do that.
Yeah. And migration policy, I think it's very interesting that this is obviously something that you've kind of like isolated as a specific sort of like
Mm,
section within the paper, and it's clear it's something that sort of like generally is kind of an issue, I think, separate from just general policy in terms of sort of like the political debate. How difficult do you think it is for sort of for Labour as a party that obviously is associated with kind of, sort of like immigration to some extent with sort of like freedom of movement previously, to be able
mm,
to make a kind of a convincing argument to those people who might be endeared towards reform, have these concerns about migration, that Labour is a party that is going to sort of like to tackle it as such without alienating the kind of other part of the Labour base, perhaps the sort of like maybe more liberal part of
yeah.
the Labour base that is sort of like maybe a bit more comfortable with the way
Yeah.
migration functions at the moment. How do you think they're able to sort of like to do that without
Yeah.
alienating both?
The reason I separated it out is because I think, firstly, the main threat is reform, and the main,
Mhm.
as I say, maybe that's changing, but the main electoral threat it seems to be coming from reform, and that is the issue, the signature issue upon which they operate. But above and beyond that, migration, I think it can cast a shadow over all the other policies because in the paper I use the analogy of a nightclub at capacity that continues to let more people in.
Mhm.
And that's how I think a lot of voters see it. You know, the policy on the bar, the queue at the bar, the cloakroom, the chaos in the cloakroom, the state of the toilets, all of that can be blamed on you're letting in too many people. That's in many voters' minds, that's a root cause. So I think it sort of isn't just any other policy area, because if it completely dominates in terms of salience, it's it can undermine pretty much everything else. So that was one of the reasons I separated it apart. And I also think, um, in relation to the second part of your point of the kind of electoral coalition, that there's a big mistake to treat it as a kind of valence issue or competence issue, in the way that, for example, you might treat police numbers or growth as or number of nurses or wait times as uncontentiously good things. Um, it's an identity issue, and there's large swathes of people in cities for whom any twist of the dial in away from where they sit is kind of a real red line for them. Um, so I kind of separated it out for that reason, basically, that I thought there was a very big risk, a Ming Vase risk, you might say, to treat it as something upon which you can simply deliver. And I think a lot of the approaches that get taken, i.e., making it harder for care workers to come to the UK, for example, come from that Ming Vase misunderstanding of the issue, which believes you can deliver on it by saying, well, we've reduced migration numbers by 30,000. Are you happy now? Um, which potentially has the worst of every world in that it does absolutely nothing to a reform curious voter, speaks of um, a kind of capitulation to the right in the eyes of a kind of more liberal big city voter, and harms the economy in the process. So it was kind of criticizing that approach, which kind of currently does the worst of every world, I would say.
Mhm. Absolutely. We're coming towards the end of the podcast. It's been wonderful to speak to you, Chris, but I do have one final question. What one or maybe two things do you hope anyone who is reading the paper or has read the paper will take away from it? And how much do you think that sort of like the kind of changing of the approach, the sort of like the Ming Vase approach, is needed now rather than later down the line, maybe a year or 18 months away from the next election?
I think if you look at the Conservative Party, they are a very good cautionary tale of what happens if you defer answering to this question, in that you essentially get completely squeezed out because you assume you can rally your base, and you assume that all the people in the home counties have always voted Conservative will do so again. And actually, oh blimey, they haven't. You've got a tiny number of seats, and you're suddenly out of the running. So I would say that it cannot be a question that's really deferred. In terms of the main takeaway, I suppose it's about, for me, focusing on what you positively stand for being always more important than what you negatively don't stand for, and working on the basis that if we are moving towards a kind of multi-party system where you're one of 6 or 7, I don't know, cans of cans of drink on the shelf, you need to say, well, why would someone choose us, rather than believing you can kind of navigate it together, navigate your way through by being clever and kind of and relying on the advantages you've always had within the marketplace. So I think there's a kind of almost a first principles element that is really central to this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me, Chris. If people want to find out more about you, to read the paper, where should they go to find out more about you and to read the paper?
Yeah, it's the I've published it basically through my uh, Substack account, which is called Parables. And if so, people type in Parables, Chris Clarke, or Chris Clarke putting down the vase, you should be able to find it there. And it's also downloadable as a kind of PDF on the same at the same place if someone would prefer to read it in that format.
Excellent. Thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.